very warm welcome to everybody who has joined this really exciting ESRC Festival of Social Science event, looking at modern slavery and the myths, the understanding, the ignorance, and some of the challenges that we have with this subject. It's a difficult and sensitive subject, but I'm very confident that our experts are going to navigate us through it. So I'm really excited to introduce the panel today. We've got Dr. Shahzad Fuladvan from the School of Sociology at the University of Sussex. She is an expert in criminal law, and she will be kicking off shortly our presentations. We've got Dr. Martin Schlepper, who is a senior lecturer in operations management from the business school at the University of Sussex. Really excited to have Martin here as well. And then from outside the university, I'm really delighted to be joined today by Richard Lancashire from Sussex Police. He's a force manager with a specialist in modern slavery, human trafficking, and organised immigration crime. So great to have the police perspective there as well. And Phil Brewer, who is a specialist advisor on modern slavery and for the Human Trafficking Foundation. So what a veritable feast of knowledge and wisdom, you'll agree. So really great to have them with us this morning. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce now Dr. Shahzad. Would you like to share your presentation with us?
Well, hi everyone. First of all, thank you to Dan and Richard, their colleagues, and also special thanks to my colleagues, university colleagues at the External Partnership Department, that they kindly organized this event for us today to discuss modern slavery issues. Yeah, I'm a lecturer in international criminal law at the Law Department at Sussex University. I have started my research on modern slavery at the Wilberforce Institute for Study of Slavery and Emancipation at Hull University, and then many years ago, I've looked at the different angles of human trafficking, modern slavery generally, and at Sussex, I'm interested in the role of corruption and criminal networks particularly. About today's kind of event, I am going to focus on 4 myths about modern slavery and kind of opening up the discussions, and I'm sure other speakers later on, they will pick up some of the similar or specifically will expand on some of the elements. The first myth I will be talking about is slavery doesn't exist today, or there isn't anything or very much that we can do. So that's the first myth. The second myth is about forced labor only happens in a developing world. Myth 3, trafficking exclusively is happening for sexual exploitation. And myth 4, forced labor isn't a big money maker. Now, starting with myth number 1, that slavery doesn't exist today, or there isn't very much we can do. It's one of the greatest myths that people think about. Some people, they think about slavery. Is that it's ended and it doesn't exist today, whereas it does exist still today, but in many different forms. Human trafficking, labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, debt bondage, forced criminality, and so on. So it does exist, in fact, but it can happen in situations where someone is forced to work and cannot refuse or leave because of threats, coercion, violence, deception, and etc., and other means. Here I put some facts and figures for you, and the global figure on the top is coming from the recent ILO report, which has estimated 40 million people being identified as victims of modern slavery. The way they have grouped them is coming under forced labor and forced marriage, in a way that forced labor includes the private economy. So 25 million people out of that 40 million are in forced labor, 16 million in the private economy, 4.8 are in forced sexual exploitation, 4.1 million in forced labor imposed by state authorities as well. And 15 million of that figure is people in forced marriage. I also highlighted 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery also identified as there are children. Looking closer, when we look at the UK, it's been estimated 10,000, something between 10,000 and 13,000 roughly there are victims of modern slavery in the UK. According to the National Referral Mechanism, which I'm sure some of you already know, that's part of the UK obligation towards the Council of Europe Convention. Their kind of figures for the first quarter of this year, from January to March 2020, there have been 2,871 potential victims referred to the NRM. And out of that number, 1,737, almost 61%, claimed to have been exploited in the UK only, and 755 exploited took place overseas. Here, I've put some images that are kind of highlighting some 4 different forms of modern slavery, but also in different sectors, just as some examples. In nail bars, car washes, forced marriage, sexual exploitation of children, in farms, and also counterlines, forced criminality. So again, carrying on the first myth that there isn't very much we can do. In fact, governments have kind of enacted different forms of legislation at different levels, international and regional level, that I put just 3 of them here. The ILO, International Labour Organization, Forced Labour Convention, number 21 and 29 in 1930, and it's 2014 protocol attached to that. It's a very important piece of legislation at international level. The second most important kind of international legislation is the UN protocol attached to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, the Trafficking Protocol, and the Council of Europe Convention on trafficking in human beings as well. But focusing on the Modern Slavery Act 2015, I just highlighted some of the important kind of facts about this. It's a very important piece of legislation that has introduced some very important mechanisms as well. So it has 7 parts and some schedules. In the first part, you can see the offences. Most importantly, it has 2 different parts. It includes human trafficking offences and also slavery, servitude, and forced labour or compulsory labour. Then there is prevention orders, risk orders under that, maritime enforcement, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, which is a very important part of the Modern Slavery Act, protection of victims, and the defense of 45, section 45 also comes under that, and transparency in supply chains also is very important in relation to the private sector, especially, and miscellaneous and general, and of course then some schedules that are not going into those in greater details. Myth number 2, it's about forced labor only happens in the developing world. In fact, it can happen all across the world, and these figures again shows the way in which it has spread all over the world. 7.6% of victims of modern slavery per 1,000 people. It's the highest number is in Africa. Then the second highest, 6.1%, is in Asia and the Pacific. 3.9% is in Europe and Central Asia, which is relatively a high number. 3.3% in Arab states. However, there may be, the estimation may not be quite accurate because of the level of the access data. And 1.9% in Americas, North America as well. Myth number 3, trafficking exclusively happens for sexual exploitation. So in fact, the 2017 ILO report shows that, if you remember from my first kind of figures that I showed you earlier, 16 million of that, 40 million in total people were, so I should correct that, in forced labor exploitation in private kind of sector, domestic worker, construction, and different kind of different sector, and agriculture. And 4.8 million people were in forced sexual exploitation. So it is not just about sexual exploitation. In fact, labor exploitation has been neglected for years or decades. Back in a recent study or the global reports of the UNODC, 83% of trafficking for sexual exploitation were women and girls, of course. On the other hand, 82% of trafficking, victims of trafficking for forced labor were men and boys. And of course, then we have the increase of organ removal trafficking as well. Myth number 4, forced labor isn't a big moneymaker. In fact, that is not true. And the, again, figures show us that in the Asia Pacific region, the profits is about $51.8 billion. So that's illegal earning from the forced labor. So that shows you the scale of the problem and the way in which the profit of this illegal business can be seen in different parts of the world. So I think I stop here, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that sobering and thoughtful opener there. I mean, just gives us a sense of the scale of the challenge. And also, as you say, bust some of those myths. I think there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of misinformation about this prevalent, certainly through business communities and so on. And I want to draw on that a little bit later, but thank you very much. That's great. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Martin Schlepper from the University of Sussex Business School to give us that perspective on this.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for that presentation. So yeah, my name is Martin Schlepper. I am Senior Lecturer in Operations and Supply Chain Management at the Department of Management at the University of Sussex Business School. I usually work around the topics of sustainable supply chain management and these issues. Also part or a fraction of my research is about modern slavery. I worked on conflict minerals, so kind of all social issues, but also environmental issues in sustainable supply chain management are of interest from me and usually my co-authors. So as already mentioned, as you can see, up to 45 people are still in slavery these days. So before I start, maybe I should mention that probably I'm the one who's mentioning the business perspective here a bit more. We mentioned already that transparency in supply chains is important. So we have the regulation perspective and the enforcement perspective, and also the victim perspective. So I'm going to represent here a bit the business or supply chain perspective. So although, as already mentioned, slavery seems to be abolished by law in almost all countries these days, de facto practices akin to it are still prevalent in many countries, as you can see. So as already mentioned, it's not just a matter of developing countries, but also of more developed countries as the UK, Germany, France, as we will see in a minute. So around 48.5% of slavery issues nevertheless still happen in Asia and bigger Asia countries like India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Uzbekistan. So I picked here some of the headlines from previous years, very recent ones. So you can see there are a lot of issues in Malaysia, in Thailand around fishery, the fishery industry. Then, of course, one big issue was Qatar World Cup workers. It's a shame it's still going on. Russia, of course, as well. They used a lot of North Korean slaves. But of course, it's not just a matter of developing countries. So we also have issues in France. We have issues in Australia, in America, and in Germany as well as, of course, in Britain. So as you can see, it's a prevalent problem. And these problems usually occur to a big extent in modern supply chains. Modern slavery in supply chains, what is it about? It's usually the exploitation of a person who's deprived of individual liberty anywhere along the supply chain, from raw material extraction to the final customer for the purpose of service provision or production. And there are, of course, some differences between old slavery or new slavery. So estimations, well, from ILO and other NGOs expect that there are more slaveries these days. There's more slavery these days in modern supply chains than there has been during the times of the Atlantic slave trade, which is quite a sad information, I think. So what's the difference between old slavery and new slavery? So old slavery or old slaves were pretty expensive. New slaves are quite cheap in terms of purchasing costs. So I think the average cost, there are also, of course, different estimates, but these days, I think slaves on average cost $90, whereas at the highest or peak times of old slavery, they were about $40,000. So there are low profits in the old slavery context, whereas high profits here, new slavery, shortage in the old times, whereas we have a surplus of potential slaves in supply these days. It's no longer about legal ownership, so there's no legal ownership included. And new slavery is focusing on short-term work, usually short-term tasks, whereas old slavery was a lifetime thing, more or less. And we usually do not attach new slavery anymore to racial difference. So, of course, there are some differences included, but this is more to cultural or legislation and other contexts, which I will mention later on. So the three main forms of slavery are chattel slavery, in which people are born, captured, or sold into permanent slavery. Then we have debt bondage slavery, which is in which people pledge themselves against loans for an undefined length of time, but the labor does not diminish the debt due to high interest rates or false accounting and so on. And then we have the contract slavery, which is fake employment, usually includes fake employment contracts, where workers are lured into the trafficking and enslavement process. So especially these two, debt bondage slavery and contract slavery, are very hard to identify for supply chain managers or managers in general, because, yeah, as I said, they are oftentimes accompanied by false accounting. Even audits cannot detect those kind of issues sometimes. So it's very, very tricky. And one problem here is that those modern supply chains are very complex in general. So, of course, there are many, many different causes for modern slavery in supply chains, and to just sum them up would be a bit simplified. But I think the main mechanism behind it is that we have seen a lot of outsourcing processes, mainly business process outsourcing since decades. And offshoring, and due to outsourcing and offshoring issues, we have many Western or more developed countries which offshored or outsourced their production processes to developing countries. So some industries now these days have over 75% of their supply base of their external value added of their supply from different developing country context. So we are talking about millions or thousands, hundreds of thousands of different suppliers. For bigger companies, these can be 75, or for a pharmaceutical company would be could be in the tens of thousands of suppliers. So there is definitely something in there which obviously increases the likelihood for modern slavery issues. So the outcome of these outsourcing and offshoring processes is a high complexity of modern supply chains and a lack of transparency, as already mentioned. So we have high geographical complexity, as I said, so the suppliers can be located everywhere in the world. At the same time, we have more suppliers for one production process sometimes, and we have longer supply chains due to the specialization in the production process. At the same time, also, maybe to add that to the complexity issues, labor versus product supply chains are different. So if you compare, for example, the construction industry, you have off-site, on-site modern slavery issues. Off-site means you can have different products or services being supplied from another country where labor issues might be involved, but then on the same hand, on the other hand, you could have on your construction site here in the developed country like the UK, for example, you could have illegal workers which are enslaved. So there is another layer of complexity which adds to the normal or regular product complexity, which makes it also more difficult to track these issues, as products can be tagged with a label or with a RFID code, for example, whereas, of course, labor or humans cannot. So, yeah, this big outsourcing process has more or less led to what we can call a race to the bottom, which includes two different perspectives. One is the corporation perspective. So, as I said, multinational companies usually try to lower their costs for production, so they outsource or offshore to developing countries, which is called low-cost country sourcing. In these countries, there are oftentimes less costly regulation requirements in terms of social and also environmental regulations, and usually these come along with big tax benefits. So the outcome is that labor usually is cheaper from those countries. There's less environmental protection, but also lower attention to health and safety, which definitely increases the likelihood for sweatshop conditions and modern slavery problems. But this is, of course, only one perspective. So we also have, well, the other part, sadly, is that governments are also from these low-cost sourcing countries sometimes try to increase foreign direct investment to keep pace with the developing countries and to attract more money, which is natural, I think. But the problem here is that they do exactly what those companies, those multinationals look for. So they protect human rights to a lesser degree. They lower the environmental regulations and loosen the social safety net. And do not allow unions sometimes. So we have a competition on that from that perspective as well, where developing countries try to attract this foreign direct investment. Although there is a silver lining, some studies say that good governance and better human rights performance, according to different indices, increases the inflow of foreign direct investment for those governments. What are the main issues coming up in terms of modern slavery? I think there are three trends. One negative definitely is the COVID-19 pandemic. So a variety of NGOs, but also the ILO have warned that COVID-19 will only increase the problems on the modern slavery side due to unemployment or an expected increase in unemployment over the next years. But there's also, as I said, some positives. So increasing global regulation is something we should watch. Australia, the Dutch government, France, they all have introduced kind of different anti-modern slavery laws and regulations and supply chain due diligence practices. So I think these are three different trends we should watch closely in the next short or midterm. Approaches to tackle modern slavery from the company side usually include something like called de-risking. So problematic suppliers are just taken off the list or out of the supply base from bigger companies. Of course, this is an easy solution, but usually it does not really tackle the problem on a larger scale because those suppliers do not just vanish. They will be taken on board by other bigger companies from other countries, maybe even. So de-risking is an easy option, but not the best one, I'd say, from a sustainable supply chain perspective. Other two trends are around collaboration. We see an increase in companies working more closely together. So in industry collaborations, where they exchange information about supplies, where they also share audits sometimes, in order to decrease the phenomenon called audit fatigue, where companies after one after another audit the same company, the same supplier, although it has just been audited by another one. So to try to avoid these problems. And we also see more partnering up with third-party stakeholders like NGOs, trade bodies, etc. The advantage of these partnerships is usually that NGOs are quite closely working on the ground with people who are directly affected with the victims of modern slavery issues and so on. So they can share more information, which might be more relevant than just information taken from companies' own audits and so on. So they are more experts probably on the victim side. Last but not least, we see luckily also a lot of companies who try actively to increase transparency in the supply chain. Of course, as I said, it's not as easy as it should be. So many companies do not have visibility further down or further upstream, so more than 2 supply steps upstream usually. Yeah, companies try to convince their supply base, or also try to force to some extent their upstream suppliers to share information, which might be necessary to increase the transparency or visibility. And also use of artificial intelligence and big data could be one solution in the future. So there was, I remember, a pilot project when the car wash problem was mentioned in the UK, and so in Nottingham, I think there was a pilot project where customers of car wash facilities could track if they see something problematic in terms of the labor provided. So they could also try to talk to those guys working manually on the car, washing it, and then send the information when they see something suspicious to an NGO or agency. So yeah, there are some approaches. Overall, I hope that it's getting better, but I think COVID-19 is posing some challenges, which will, at least in the short term, not make it easier to tackle the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Again, a really clear set of insights there, if not overly cheery, but important, and gives us a really good sense of the depth of this. The eternal optimist in me thinks, goodness, we're in 2020, surely the conditions for slavery are long gone as we develop our sense of structures, regulation, and the way that we trade. But clearly, actually, the conditions are better than ever for people to exploit this. So that feels like a good point then to move on to Richard Lancashire from Sussex Police, whose job is to enforce and to kind of eke out where this is happening in our region, and to try and stop it. So Richard from Sussex Police.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks very much indeed. My name is Richard Lancashire. My title is the Modern Slavery Manager, Force Manager in Sussex Police, and my responsibility is to try and drive the progress to the response to modern slavery and organised immigration crime, not only in Sussex Police, but also in collaboration with our partners in the county. From the outset, I would say that there is probably a slight misconception as to exactly how much work goes into a modern slavery investigation. The amount of evidence, the difficulties to collect evidence, and a number of sort of nuances in relation to the interpretation of the law are considerable, and it is quite a challenge for investigators. You may know or may not know that virtually every modern slavery case that originates from a national referral mechanism referral, i.e. the compliance to Section 52 of the Modern Slavery Act, arrives with police detectives. by a much greater proportion than would ever be considered by other law enforcement agencies. So the demand on them is great. So over the next couple of minutes, I'd like to basically just to offer maybe 5 different areas just to maybe to think about and discuss, and prompt some questions if you wish. So the first one is in relation to modern slavery being a hidden crime. This is something you'll see in enormous amounts of documents and guides and presentations. And what I would say is, when you look across other areas of criminal behaviour, is this really hidden? Is what they're doing really hidden? Shahzad earlier on discussed a couple of different scenarios and industries where modern slavery might manifest itself. Are they hidden? Is a person sitting 6 feet from someone having their nails done hidden? Are the amount of people that are dealing drugs on the street that support, say, the demand for illicit drugs, are they hidden? Or yes, they go about their business discreetly because obviously they want to get caught, but actually modern slavery is there to be seen by anybody and everybody. So I would say, I would contest that it's a hidden crime. Perhaps in some cases, or some way of thinking, it actually, we as a sort of race might actually feel more comfortable hearing people saying that it's hidden, because it may actually reduce the need or the expectations of us to be vigilant. So in saying that it's hidden, it's almost like saying, well, you might as well not bother looking for it because you won't see it, because it's tucked away in the shadows, in the dark areas. I would say more likely we are conditioned and desensitized to where it actually appears in full view, with some exceptions, obviously. So that's the sort of first point, and I think it would be really nice maybe to have a look at what documents and what learning has been created over the years to substantiate precisely why people think it's hidden. The second point really, and I apologise, this is probably way less academic than some of the other contributors are going to probe, but forgive me, I barely got any A-levels. So the second point is in relation to the interpretation of the word trafficking. So you will notice on a daily basis that people will talk about migrants being trafficked between 2 different areas of the world, or into the UK or across UK borders. And if you look at the dictionary definition of trafficking, it just means moving something, and most people sort of liken the phrase when it's used in the context of drugs trafficking, moving drugs for illicit purpose across different areas. Also, in relation to the way that the press portray it, they very, very readily use the term trafficking. I haven't got any particular objections to them using those sorts of phrases. Where the rub is, of course, is in relation to the legal terms. So when we're talking about human trafficking, it very specifically is articulated in relation to the terminology and the convention signed, I think almost 10 years ago to the day, in Palermo in Italy, where trafficking really relates to the recruit, harbouring, exchange of control over people, or facilitation, but with the common denominator for the objective, or with a view to exploit them. A lot of people will talk about smuggling rather than trafficking. If you look at in different headlines in different newspapers, they will use almost the term as an interchangeable. It is quite awkward when some people seek to say, no, of course it's not trafficking at all, it's just smuggling. It doesn't really matter, but as long as we understand that the people that are often assisting people or charging people exorbitant amounts of money to travel across a certain body of water, does not mean to say that they had any expectation or any view or objective to exploit them, either by themselves or people connected with them. So a trafficker could actually traffic a person between 2 roads in the same town, with the UK border being absolutely irrelevant. Or it could be from between China and the UK, traveling through 30 countries. The actual distance on the UK border isn't really specified. It could be shoving a person into the country, out of the country, or anywhere within the country of any distance, as long as the objective is for exploitation. So the third thing I was going to talk about was in relation to work as opposed to labour exploitation. So where would a person doing a job in any industry we have in the UK, where is that simply legal work, and where is the line to which it becomes exploitation? I've got a couple of points there you can see on the slide. Has the person doing the work actually physically applied for the work? Did they know what the pay was, either before or during? Could they leave at any time? You know, it may imagine yourself in an exploiter's shoes and say, well, no, they weren't chained up. They could come and go as they pleased. They were happy to do it. The villain could say, I'm not a criminal. They were just literally employees. So you'll all have seen in enormous amounts of documents and guides talking about the indicators where one might sort of transfer into the other one. It is not an easy job to differentiate between them. The HMRC have a minimum wage team. Just because someone is getting low wage does not mean to say that they're being necessarily exploited by labour according to the law. So again, put yourself back in the shoes of a cop, of a detective. So someone saying that they earned, I don't know, £75 a day for a particular piece of work. Have they got £75 a day's worth of cash in a box or in a bank account or somewhere that is visible? Are they in control of that bank account? Have they been conditioned or instructed to tell you they're earning £75 a day when they've actually not even earned 75 pence per day? The people that are working behind the scenes in modern slavery, and Phil, who's going to talk after me, has got extensive experience and leading teams, who will find that the phrase that I'm earning 50 or 60 or 70 pounds a day to do a certain job is almost like a script that 90% of workers use, irrespective of whether or not they are doing so or not. In relation to could they leave? Well, we all know that you don't have to be chained or physically manacled to a workplace to actually be compelled to remain where you are. It could easily be it could be suggested that a domestic violence victim, why did he or she not leave after the first time she was assaulted? We all know that people stay there for decades for unbelievably complicated trauma reasons. It was only last year, I think, or no, the year before, the authorities in Cumbria discovered a man who'd been living in a shed from 1978 to 2018. So 40 years from the age of 18, he was compelled to work in exploitative circumstances in Cumbria. And you'd only have to look at Google to see the size and appearance of that shed. It's just quite heartbreaking to see that. Why did they not leave? How can we articulate that? Also, people, when you're talking about people being willing to work, let's say, for instance, as a foreign national who has come to the UK to do a certain work or has been made to do certain work, and they're earning £3 a day. It may actually be that £3 a day is a competitive wage where they come from, because they're expecting that, and they think it's very similar to what they would have got originally when it's more steady. Does that mean to say that the person employing them is not exploiting them? Of course not. And of course, Section 1, subsection 5 of the Modern Slavery Act removes that barrier that prevents us from prosecuting those who are exploiting apparent willing workers. But this one's in relation to who is a victim and who is a criminal. So you'll probably, if you're on this call, you're interested in modern slavery, and you'll know there is a statutory defence to victims who commit offences, and that is in relation to Section 45 of the Act. But of course, when you see in Sussex, probably identically to almost every other part of the UK, if you were to encounter someone who is caught dealing drugs or stealing phones or something, what we've got to ask ourselves is what were they running their own criminal enterprise? Were they committing crime to fund a particular aspect of their life? Were they perhaps part of a joint sort of group, a conspiracy group for jointly benefit financially from committing this crime? Or could they have been groomed or deceived or coerced to commit crime? If a person who was perhaps under the control and employ of an organised crime network and was told to go and steal fuel from vehicles, and there were punitive consequences should he not, then should he be convicted for the crime? Well, of course, what the obligation is, or the expectation is for the law enforcement communities to understand what could be the backstory, and to understand what type of investigative lines of inquiry and tactics we can use to reveal what the backstory is. So I would be really interested to know what messages that person's had on their phone. I'd be really interested to know what that person is able to disclose, but not from a quick question answer with a uniformed cop, but maybe through a very, very well prepared and organized cognitive interview by someone specializes in trauma, because they may well disclose completely different things depending on who's asking them. And also, of course, we're very used to, this isn't a new thing, we're very used to dealing with the common law areas of duress. No one would expect a bank manager who opens a bank door to someone who's holding his family to a gunpoint to be criminalized for what he did. And of course, that legislation is there and has been there for a long time. And the final bit I was going to mention was in relation to what I quite often hear is it's a police matter. So in a way, it's right. For those that are maybe aware, when one of the organisations that are designated to refer potential victims to the Home Office via the National Referral Mechanism, almost every single case that they receive is allocated to a detective in a police force. In fact, Sussex at the moment, I think the demand for the detectives in Sussex, which is quite a small force compared to those around the country, are have the fourth greatest demand for allocated cases of any force in the country. So we're right up there. We'll forget the Met for a moment because they literally are just huge and eclipse everybody. But some of the other large metropolitan forces, we are up there in relation to investigative demand, and we are actually quite a small force. However, modern slavery is a subject that by necessity has to have enormous amounts of partnership working. And there on this slide, you can just see a couple of the sort of different categories of partners that is necessary for us to work with. And you can see a little headline that I've placed on the slide there, that only last month we were very privileged to get a pledge that was signed by the local authorities across the county in support of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to try and make the communities of Sussex slavery free. And that isn't just an empty pledge. That comes with it a large document of a statement of intent in relation to how they'll go about that, particularly within the interoperability with the police. And we have very extensive networks in Sussex to try and make sure that everybody knows what they're doing, everybody with a piece of information is able to provide it, and it all feeds into the mix. Obviously, it's a evolving partnership, but we believe we're really completely going in the right direction. Now, whilst I have a certain part of knowledge and involvement in these partnerships and networks, and we do have a couple of people from those networks on this session, by far and away a bigger expert in the interoperability between the different people on that sort of list on this slide and law enforcement is a former colleague and now one of your panelists, Phil Brewer. So with that in mind, if there aren't any particular questions at this moment, then I will stop there.
A little bit more reassurance in there, I think, in terms of the picture of cooperation and action and enforcement. So really welcome your expertise on that. Thank you. So well, you were doing my job for me there and introducing Phil. So Phil, over to you.
Thanks very much. Just to give you a little bit of background, so Phil Brewer, I up until last year, I worked with the Met Police. I was the head of their modern slavery and kidnap unit, and then I retired. And I know many of you in the audience will be looking, thinking, how can someone in their mid-30s manage to retire already? But it's, you know, I've had an easy life, I guess. I am a modern slavery nerd, which is probably not as polite as the way Richard described as an expert, but it's something that absolutely fascinates me. So since retiring from the police, I've ended up working for a couple of charities. One of those is the Human Trafficking Foundation, also do some work to stop the traffic. And I am halfway through my master's at St Mary's University, Twickenham, where I'm studying human trafficking, migration and organised crime. I posed the question, or maybe a myth is that combating modern slavery is all about the police, government agencies, arresting offenders, and that terrible term of rescuing victims. And I'm going to try and dispel that by just running through sort of, give you a little bit of technical, and then I'll put that into some practical examples. So 2014, just before the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act, the government introduced a strategy which is based around the 4 Ps, which is a strategy which sits with counter-terrorism, but it was adopted and put in place for modern slavery. And I'll sort of briefly run through that just to give you an idea of sort of where government was coming from. So Pursue very much speaks for itself. It's about effectively doing stuff, arresting offenders, type of police investigation, very much in the remit of law enforcement. Prevent is an interesting P. When it was set up in 2014, this was about preventing people from becoming offenders. And this is probably one of the most difficult areas in terms of combating modern slavery. And over the years, I've seen that morph from out and out being about sort of looking at offenders, and now prevent is very much spoken about preventing people from becoming victims in the first place. So an interesting play on words in terms of addressing government strategy. Protect is that bit about protecting victims, and the final bit, prepare. Probably the easiest way to describe this is building a framework that helps support the other 3 Ps. So just looking at a Pursue point of view, NGOs, charities, or sort of non-government organisations, charities absolutely have a vital role to play in this. And it does absolutely extend beyond providing accommodation and supporting victims. So for my time in the Met, we worked really closely with a number of charities that were based in London. And they worked alongside us in sort of some of the operations that we did. Probably the best example of that is conducting brothel visits. We would always work with charities going into brothels because most of the time, most of the people that we engaged with within those, and going back to what's already been spoken about, this being a hidden crime or people denying that they're victims, you know, quite often a police officer asking an individual, are you a victim of modern slavery? Is there something I can do to help? Will quite often be met with, no, this is a choice. I've made this choice. Leave me alone. I don't want to speak to you. Where an NGO, particularly those NGOs that offer outreach work, will pick up that relationship and start to build that support and that trust and reassurance that actually, if you get to that tipping point where you feel confident enough to seek help, you know that that NGO will be able to help you. So a really good way of sort of prolonging that relationship to a point where it gives someone more than just a one-off chance of saying, yes, I am a victim, I need help. Working alongside operationally is absolutely important. Quite a lot of planning goes into most police operations, and actually having that critical friend alongside to actually work along with you, give you some guidance around what will work, what won't work when you are trying to reach out with highly vulnerable individuals, is worth its weight in gold. So it's actually, you know, it's actually important that we get that point of view. And also, you know, NGOs and charities, faith groups have helped us out enormously over the years in terms of things such as reception centres, somewhere, a safe place that we can take victims, where it actually removes them from the situation where they're being exploited, with a greater chance of them disclosing that they need help. Prevent and protect is a really important bit, and it's something that's not always sort of spoken about in great detail. So, you know, some of those things that are quite obvious, you know, sort of training and raising awareness is something that NGOs have sort of done for years, and I would say are sort of the main leaders in relation to this. But prevention campaigns have worked really well. Stop the Traffic, who I work with, do some fantastic targeted work in terms of raising awareness around workers' rights, in terms of labour exploitation in particular, and targeting specific communities. So the slide there is from Facebook. It's a campaign that we've run for, I think, just over 2-3 years, so before my time, targeting Lithuanian nationals working within the Fenlands. And working with social media does give us that opportunity to really target specific communities through geolocating where users are. It ensures that a bespoke message can get out, and the reach can be quite phenomenal. In some respects, based on Facebook data, we can reach over 90% of the population that fit the profile of potential victims. So we can get really bespoke messaging out to the right people. And some of the information that we provide will be sort of signposting to organisations within that location who can provide support. We can do awareness campaigns, we can do awareness videos, which also reassures us that not only are we reaching the right people, that people are actually doing a little bit more to understand or to obtain information. And also sort of click on buttons within Facebook, sort of learn more buttons, which also demonstrates that people have gone sort of more than above than just reading that initial sort of message. And Martin sort of touched on this in terms of NGOs. A number of NGOs, specialist teams, will work within the private sector, because one of the big bits about sort of prevent and protect is building in processes within organisations and businesses that start to make exploitation, whether it's within supply chains or through processes, sort of more hostile. So we've done a lot of work with sort of financial institutions. We've helped them develop policies around things such as bank accounts for homeless victims or homeless individuals. So it means that they can actually access something that can help them start to build on a bit of security. We've worked with a number of businesses where we've helped look at supply chains and and sort of help them question some of their suppliers around working practices. And so, you know, it sort of builds in that sort of support for them in terms of ensuring that they're not caught out and they find themselves, you know, providing services or products that have exploitation within their supply chain. And prepare is the bit that Richard touched on as well. So this is about NGOs and charities helping lead on local collaborations, and these are so important, and they're important that they're done at a local level. Exploitation manifests in different ways. Modern slavery manifests in different ways. What I used to see in London, is totally different to what you might see in the Fenlands or sort of more agricultural based areas. Totally different. And it's important that you bring together those people that can make a difference within your local area by encouraging them to be part of partnerships. And I put up there something that it's only published a couple of weeks ago. University of Nottingham Rights Lab published a document which is Partnerships for Freedom. It's easy to find. If you search Partnerships for Freedom and Nottingham, you will find it on Google, and that gives sort of a voice to the community to help shape local policies, and Richard touched on that earlier on, and procedures in terms of what is important from a policing perspective, etc. And probably most importantly for me is that we quite often rely on things such as the national referral mechanism and the data that we obtain from that to provide a snapshot of what modern slavery looks like within your area. But the true reality is that there are a number of communities, for whatever reason, individuals that are well below the radar because, seeking help from the authorities may result, if you've got questionable immigration status, to being removed back to a point that you'd escaped from. So actually working with NGOs, those sort of groups and charities that have trust of those hard to reach and hard to hear communities actually gives them a voice in this. And it means that you can still look at building sort of prevent and protect strategies, even where there isn't any direct contact between law enforcement, statutory agencies and potential victims. I hope that was of interest, and I'll hand back to Richard.
Thank you very much. What brilliant presentations we've had today. I've been absolutely riveted. We've had the regulatory sort of legal perspective from Shahzad. We've had the economic perspective from Martin, the enforcement side from Richard, and there the sort of NGO slash victims and how do we support them from Phil. So really interesting. The first questions that are coming through, and actually what I was going to pick up on as well, is looking at the local landscape. Some really interesting points raised there by a couple of you around the situation in Sussex in particular. But maybe a question to all of you is why Sussex? I was, in thinking about this event the other day, very attuned into the headlines around the boat seized in Shoreham Port, which had a number of people on there. The headline being, 5 slaves discovered at Shoreham Port. A lot of work I've done in the past makes me very acutely aware of county lines and the very significant challenge we have around drugs and young people that was mentioned earlier as well. So what is it about Sussex? There's no huge cities here. There's no, it doesn't have some of the infrastructure that other urban places would have, nor major international ports apart from maybe Gatwick. Any enlightenment on what's going wrong here?
Yeah, so just to clarify that I don't think Sussex is got any higher numbers of modern slavery cases than anywhere else in the country. What we do have is, like 1 or 2 other places in the country, we do have immigration detention estate. Mm-hmm. And it may very well be that when you have people who have been detained by the Home Office, that they may well be able to provide information about recent past or maybe greatly historic experiences they've had around the world that would qualify for us to record and look at their allegation. So sometimes the data will sometimes reflect that. In relation to the amount of people who may be involved in the drug distribution business that could conceivably be regarded as potential victims or any other areas, we're no different from any other area. And what I would encourage people to do is on the Gov UK website, you'll be able to access the National Referral Mechanism stats going back many years. I think currently, I think the last 2019 stats was we were about just over 10,000 victims referred through that referral mechanism, but the amount of people that are encountered in any particular scenario of exploitation is the same almost across the board. All I would say is, like Phil mentioned earlier, that it may well be that in certain counties a greater proportion is in relation to rural crime and agriculture and exploitation, whereas elsewhere there may be more to do with drugs and labour and trafficking for sexual exploitation. So the balance can change from one place to the other. What I will say, though, of course, is geographically we're sat sort of midway between the ports of Kent, Folkestone, Dover, Tilbury, Felixstowe, Essex, and Southampton and Portsmouth. We have Gatwick on our doorstep. We have the 100 lines of coastline, and of course we have got this proximity to London. The one thing I would just make sure people understand is, when you're talking about ports and arrivals of those overseas, they may not necessarily be remotely connected to modern slavery. They may simply be irregular migrants, and the two areas cross, but they are not the same thing. So I would say that yes, we've got numbers. Yes, it is an area that we have to concentrate on and prioritise, but we aren't significantly higher than a comparable county of our size elsewhere in the country.
Thank you, though, for the clarification. Again, the boat issue may be another how the kind of language within the press and media is as you say earlier, a little bit interchangeable and not always particularly helpful.
I would say the matter you saw in the press in relation to Shoreham, that's an ongoing investigation, so I probably wouldn't be right for me to comment on that. But the headline is correct. It's an investigation that has modern slavery at the heart of it, but obviously it's an ongoing matter.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to make a comment on the Sussex issue, or anything about the sort of geographical nature and influence of where modern slavery happens?
Richard, I'm happy to sort of chip in as well. I think some of the challenges have always been about recording modern slavery offences, and if you take it from a victim point of view, you've been through such a traumatic experience, and then you speak to the authorities, and the first thing they want to know is where did the offence happen, sort of name the streets, individuals, and having gone through something that traumatic, even if you can remember bits, I would suggest a lot of people would struggle to put it into any sort of time concept. And so what you end up with from a policing point of view is there's a desperate need to record a venue somewhere, and it's often recorded as the point where that disclosure is made. And it's exactly the same as the point that Richard was making. We had a saying within the Met, which was the Lunar House effect. So Croydon had significantly more allegations of modern slavery than anywhere else in London most of the time. And the reason for that is because Lunar House, which is a Home Office office where you can go to report if you've entered the UK either unlawfully, and I put that in inverted brackets, or if you're seeking asylum, that is where you'll go. And that is probably at the point where you would disclose that you are a victim of modern slavery. So as a result of that, Croydon saw particularly higher numbers. I think other things that, certain detention centres, I think where people end up being placed as well. Some places in East Sussex in particular may see a number of people housed within that, within accommodation within those areas. Probably Hastings is a good example, and that may actually see a slight rise in the number of offences. So one thing I'll say, and I'm sure all the panellists will agree on this, is one thing about modern slavery data is it's consistently inconsistent. So although it does give you a snapshot, it can sometimes also be quite misleading.
I want to bring Shahzad and Martin back in first, just thinking about from a sort of economic, business and regulatory perspective, thinking about the policy. So most businesses since 2015 and the Act have to publish a modern slavery policy on their website to be clear about how they are monitoring their supply chains, etc. I'm interested to know whether you think that that has been effective at bringing it to be kind of really conscious in the minds of businesses, or whether that's just become lip service and actually encourage people to be a bit desensitized and just sort of go, well, we've got that bit of paper that we've used a template for, therefore job done. And also about our kind of global relationships. You know, the UK is at an interesting point at the moment where it's renegotiating trade deals left, right, and centre. It's looking at our relationships with other countries, as well as our legal frameworks in terms of global positioning. Is this a positive opportunity to influence and to kind of assert our expectations around modern slavery in a way that perhaps some of those the kind of global economic conditions that Martin mentioned that have actually increased modern slavery, you know, is this an opportunity to do something positive to counter it?
Yeah, definitely. So since 2015, I think the Modern Slavery Act has made a difference in terms of how companies tackle the issue, or if they have it on their agenda at all. So before, I think, although I have not real first-hand experience, but I'd say, well, what you get from media and other NGOs and also from the companies themselves is that that wasn't really a big topic. And as we've seen, and as we've also seen in the questions here today, or which you will pick up later, I think it is a matter of awareness. And if there is no law, no regulation, it's sometimes difficult for companies or businesses to get the thing really running. So there are of course a lot of voluntary schemes as well, and companies have their code of conduct in place, which also somehow prescribe to act ethically in these kind of circumstances. But of course, it makes a big difference if you have a regulation, a hard regulation to which you have to comply and to which you have to report. And yeah, I wouldn't say it's lip service because first of all, the reports are checked, but they're not so much checked only by the government or by enforcement agencies, but also by the NGOs who have put big scrutiny on these kind of things and can definitely compare. So you enable a competition between different companies from the same industry, for example, who are more active, more proactive in these areas. So yeah, the stakeholder demand for this information is definitely increasing due to the law, I think, and it has an effect on companies which are not only based in the UK. As you can see, these regulations pop up everywhere now. So yeah, it's definitely an important step towards more compliance or more activity in this area.
Thank you. That's great. Very encouraging. Shahzad, did you have anything to add from a policy?
Well, in terms of the statements, so companies who are their kind of profit is going to be above £36 million a year based on the Modern Slavery Act. So they have to produce their statements and they have to make that public on the website. So I think in terms of transparency, maybe that's a positive thing to do. But of course, that's not the whole thing, but at least it's some sort of actions that can help in terms of the transparency in supply chains. That Martin is an expert on that, and possibly Phil and Rich, they can make more comments on that from the practical point of view. And in terms of other points, I think just following up what Phil and Rich again, they mentioned, it is not just that generally speaking, this problem of modern slavery in Sussex or anywhere else, it's not just a matter of the law enforcement to deal with. That's not the mere responsibility. I think the understanding of the responsibility has to be shared. The responsibility, every citizen has to take that responsibility. I think that's the most important thing. Then that responsibility can come under different kind of variety of bodies. Could it be NGOs or charities or faith communities or individuals? The kind of goods that we are, buying, the kind of people that they can live in our road, or any kind of signs that we can be careful and we can be vigilant and we can also help perhaps. So that kind of responsibilization, I think, is very important and to think about. It's not just about the responsibility of one particular organ to deal with. Mm-hmm. That is not going to work. If it was going to work, today we wouldn't have a problem of anything to do with slavery or modern slavery.
Thank you. Viviana says, you know, in her experience, most people have no idea about modern slavery. So what is the panel's view on public awareness, not just to detect it, but also to do something about it? And Tony says as well, you know, could you give an indication of what you think people in Sussex, regardless of their professional interest, can do to help eradicate this?
Yeah, in relation to public perception, obviously everybody in the industry does their very best to try and push information out. Just in Sussex Police, we have a number of different media, internal, external media campaigns. We work closely with Crime Stoppers and other charities to push information out there. And I know in relation to other agencies, and some of the ones that Phil represents, you know, they're all pushing stuff out there, but there is definitely a matter of how many times do you notice the poster you pass. So an example would be that, you know, I spoke to a bunch of people not too long ago, and I asked them for their perception on the design of a poster that was on a notice board in the entrance to the building they were coming in. Obviously, I'd placed one there in relation to modern slavery. These people walked past this notice board twice a day, at least every day of their working life, didn't even know there was a notice board there. So in relation to public perception and the information we give them in order to be vigilant, sometimes we've got to be creative in how we are telling people what to be vigilant about, and don't always fall down the trap of doing sort of you know, posters and sound bites. We also, there's a lot of stuff that has been placed through the press. In relation to what Sussex communities can do, well, the Safer Communities websites in the local authorities, and you've got the lead professional from West Sussex County Council on the call today. They put enormous amounts of information out there, what to do, who to call, the scenarios to be vigilant about, and what can be done. The helplines, the hotlines, the 24/7 confidential lines run by various organisations. So it's all out there, but increasingly the key is to how we can put something in the front of people's minds to make them aware there and then. I'll give a little example of something that we did last year. Is trying to think about the way we can capture information, and we were thinking about labour exploitation in what would be genuinely regarded as a legitimate workplace. So we worked with Crime Stoppers to put a 11-metre LED screen on the side of a road where we absolutely knew would be gridlocked with traffic for at least an hour and a half, both at the start of and the end of the day. And the rationale behind that was to try and give people enough information that when they went into their workplace at the end of that torturous commute, that they actually had a chance to think about the different roles and areas in their workplace, and maybe be moved to report something or to escalate something. But that was specifically designed for that. So I would just make sure that for the communities that they look in the places that's got the best information on what it is they might be able to see, what that thing actually means, and where they can go with it.
Thank you very much. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to bring Mirella in, who had a question.
Yeah, well, I was just reading the chat, and Viviana's point, could it be possible for the EU and England to pressure China and Asian countries to implement better labor conditions? So I just wanted to add, but it's not so easy. So it's not so simple as it looks like. So there is regulation. There is also an attempt to implement decent labor standards through trade agreements. And the EU as part of the UK as part of the EU, and also other countries to try to do that. For companies who have a very long supply chain and they work mainly overseas, not always this is the interest, because as Martin explained, this is a way to cut costs. And you know, for the national government is no interest to harm these companies, including, you know, British companies. For example, one key to implement transparency in supply chain is to use public procurement. For example, that the government will not give contracts to companies who can't prove that they have a completely transparent supply chain and they know about working conditions in their suppliers base. This is not easy to achieve at all because you need a lot of auditing. You need also independent agencies, very well trained people. And again, you have to consider that there is a lobby from the business, for the businesses in general, to have as less troubles as possible. So we have to be very honest when we talk about these issues, and probably we have also to differentiate between what is happening locally and what does this mean at international level when you really have hundreds of suppliers abroad. So, for example, kid labor in Moldova is not even considered kid labor. They passed a legislation to allow people, kids from 15 years old to work, and just becomes legal. So it's very, very, it's a complex situation, and you have to keep together both sides, what we do here and what happens abroad.
Thank you, Mirella. And is this a professional or research interest of yours?
Yeah, I work with Martin in the same department. So I'm also a lecturer in supply chain management and logistics, and I work mainly on textile and clothing. Labor conditions, mainly in Eastern Europe, and these are issues that probably happen also in other supply chains, not only for this commodity. So yeah, that is my area.
Thank you very much. Well, sadly, time has moved against us. There's a couple of other questions in the chat bar, but there's some great answers coming through there as well. I just want to thank our 4 contributors today. I thought they were absolutely brilliant in providing clarity and kind of a really well-informed overview on what is a very challenging subject. So big thank you to Shahzad, to Martin, to Richard, and to Phil. So thank you all for coming. Tricky subject, but I think despite the gloom, I certainly feel that there's a huge amount of work being done and some big progress being made. So it feels that there's we're getting there. Otherwise, thank you very much, and see you all soon.